Well, thank you for this fantastic introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and it's always good to be able to actually explain or actually share our thoughts, really, how we see the energy transition going to take place. We're known for our scenarios. We do it right for more than 40 years, and every so many times, right, in history, say in our scenario making, we have a kind of called a fork in the road. You know, something like really something drastic happened. In the very early beginnings, it was, of course, the emergence of OPEC, and that did something completely different to our industry in price forming and opened up new areas. Then, somewhere in the 80s, it was all about what we thought about sustainable growth versus dematerialization. And actually, the fork in the road was actually that this unbridled energy use, this connection between the GDP and our energy use, could not be sustainable. And therefore, all future pathways would lead to efficiency scenarios. And actually last decade we had another fork in the road in our scenarios, and that was actually that, say, emitting as usual would not be possible anymore in our views, and therefore all future scenarios would be one of decarbonization. Now once you got that right, you talk about transitions in big time. And actually there are multiple transitions going on in the world and in our industry, but I'll just focus on the energy part this side. And before I go, this is the key message, really. This is the CO2 pathways. And the light blue line is the MIT business as usual case. And let me say it very upfront, that is just not sustainable for a number of reasons, not even say for CO2, but also for the amount of energy that we'll be needing. And then you see some colored lines underneath, that's our scenarios, Ocean Mountains, we published a couple of years ago. And there's a kind of end state, which is almost what they call near zero emission world there. You can make a net zero emission world. So by the end of the centuries, these two scenarios in the decarbonization mindset we have lead to a carbon neutral world. Now, the range you see underneath is basically what you need to achieve that near zero emission world. If you want a 2 degrees world, it will be the answer 2070. If you want a 1.5 degrees world, then you need to achieve that in 2050. Now, for once in this presentation, I'm not going to give you the scenario in a pure sense that I actually give you the pathway. I'm just going to explain a plausible end state, how we could achieve a net zero emission world, bring prosperity for everyone. And then I leave the pathway, how you want to achieve it, to your own imaginations, how you want to get there. But before we go there, let me just pick up that point on how much energy do we actually need. The world economy is growing and we'll need more energy. And you see here between the Human Development Index and energy use that, say, major resource holders like North America, Middle East, they need an awful lot of energy, about twice as much as we in Europe to have a decent lifestyle. But actually, do we need so much? Because all this 5.8 billion people coming towards us want the same lifestyle. If they have the same kind of prosperity and use the same energy consumption as North America, we need to make our global energy system 6 times bigger. That's a lot. Now, a European lifestyle, only 3 times bigger. But that's still an awful lot from where we're going. So then actually the question is, how much would you really need? And we actually postulate here that about 100 gigajoules per person is good enough instead of the 150 we have in Europe. If we just look plausible projections of how more efficient we can be, 100 gigajoules is quite okay. And then times 10 billion peoples by the end, somewhere in the second half of this century, that would mean about doubling our energy system, about 1,000 exajoules for scientists. So actually, that's how it's going to look like. Today, the world is about 80% fossil, and the rest is the non-carbon, not to account. But the new world then actually will be 2/3 of the energy system will be from renewables. Wind, solar, bit of hydro, and also a lot of biomass still. And if you take the yellow bit, say nuclear with it, that's about 3/4 being carbon neutral. But we still see in a net zero emission world the requirements for about 25% hydrocarbon fuels. And why is that? Well, you can't do everything with electrons. You also will need molecules. And you can't do everything with biomolecules. So we still need fossil fuels. Does it matter? Well, not too much, really, because there are certain things you do with it. About 1/3 will just go in plastics. So fine, that's not emitting until you burn it again. But there's a few parts you can't really decarbonize, and that is what we call the heavy-duty transport, aviation, shipping, trucking. That will still need hydrocarbons. And of course, you still need a certain degree of backup for renewable power generation. So those are the three main components. There's a little triangle there, and that actually means that you need carbon capture and storage to actually achieve that net zero emission world. And actually, carbon capture and storage on fossil fuels, yes, is important, but even more important is to apply it on biomass, on biofuels. That is when you really create that offset, that negative emission for those sectors, like heavy-duty transport, you cannot decarbonize. So this is the kind of concept we have for a net zero emission world. And then where should it come from? Well, from all throughout the whole energy value chain. So of course we talk about substitution of primary energy sources, oil and wind, etc. But also don't forget conversion. The efficiency needs to take enormously drastic further steps to improve. And that can be done, but it won't be easy. And then on the consumption side, that quite efficiency also has a dimension on behavioral change. How we use energy, how we actually avoid waste, and actually how we actually, well, design our lives around compact cities or not, as the case may be. So in these things are all required, but different sectors, different countries go on their own pace of development, of actually how fast they can change. That is to do with infrastructure, how long things live, but also certain countries just can't go that fast because they may not have a certain resource base, or when you're in an emerging economy, have a lot of coal in your ground, you're going to use that. And we should be okay with that. As long as everyone moves to that direction, we will in the end get there. So different paces at different places at different times. And then here's the energy system. Well known, this is actually showing the flows, and these that kind of, what is it, light blue stuff is power, is electricity generation. And in the debate of decarbonization, normally, or substitution, you always hear it's electricity. Now electricity is of course very important, let's face it, but it's only 40% of the solution. 60% of the solution has to come from the end consumer sectors, industry, households, and transport. So although, the electricity sector will lead the way in transition, ultimately we have to have it also elsewhere. And I like to go a little bit more in detail in different sectors, because there's a kind of red and green and orange color coding, if you can see that. That's basically how easy or how difficult it is to decarbonize such sectors, these demand sectors. But before we go to demand sectors, let's go to electricity generation, because that's the focus of today. Well, just the first maybe nice thing to know is that total energy consumption of electricity is less than 20%. So 80% is not electricity, which also needs to be decarbonized. Electricity, actually, when you go to a decarbonization world, right, you need much more electrification, much more power. You have to go from that around 20% market share to around 50% market share, which means you have to build an enormous amount of power generation throughout the world. A factor 5 or 6 I show here between two scenarios. And yes, you can decarbonize it with a lot of wind and solar. That is a given. It's absolutely a given, because in our modeling by mid-2020s, right, it's just the cheapest kilowatt hour in your homes. So that's going to happen. And then you have hydrocarbons. That's basically a choice. Do you have it or not? Do you have carbon capture sequestration to offset things, or you don't have that? And then you have different mixes. But electrification becomes very important, because if you want to decarbonize and you want high efficiency, you have to have more power. Electric engines instead of internal combustion engines, and also say, for instance, your very efficient gas boiler in the end has to be replaced by a heat pump. And that kind of things takes quite a bit of effort when you look at the sectors. And I just take here one sector as example, is industry, because that's one of the most difficult to decarbonize. Now, in a sense, you could say Denmark is a bit privileged in that, because you don't have such a big industrial sector than China. And actually, in our projection, even that goes further down, because you start importing your goods, so you don't have that direct count. But if you look at that little graph underneath, the blue is the electricity part. And you see that now on global scale, but electricity is about 20% of the energy consumption, but that has to go to about 3/4. And here's this enormous dual challenge for industry. Now, Jesper showed us, we're going to grow our economies and pretty fast. Well, by the end state, probably it's not 2.5 times what we have now. It's about 3.5 times richer than we now, on average. And all these people, right, all these about 7 billion people, extra people, want the same amount of good as us? Fine, but only with 40% more primary energy input. Just think about a dual challenge for industry. You have to deliver those goods, and much more efficient, and you have to change your whole infrastructure or how you produce those costs. And that won't be an easy challenge, maybe technologically, but just to finance that is very difficult as well. Well, so that's one thing, but also, of course, certain parts of the industry will be very difficult to decarbonize, particularly metal making and cement. But other ones you can do more. Let me see if I have. No, I don't have the what is it? The transport sector. But let me just say a little bit, because I saw the electric vehicle picture. A lot of people are very seeing that as the thing on the wall, right? This is going to change us, and it's very fast. And yes, maybe by 2040, 1.5, if you're really lucky, then you already have 50% of the sales have to be electric vehicles. If you really go very aggressive, something like 4 million barrels to 6, whatever the assumptions are. But I would argue that that difference in oil demand by 2040 is still the thickness of the line if you take the GDP uncertainties in consideration and other ones. So EVs is really, of course, in our face, we can see that, but actually other disruptive innovations, like basically doubling the efficiency of internal combustion engines, will have much more effect on oil demand than actually electric vehicles will have in this period. So, giving this period, say, to 2040, next 2 decades, while we're doing a transition to a low carbon world, the world will still need more hydrocarbons, oil and gas, particularly, not in the West, of course, not here, but actually in emerging economies. So that needs to be done, and at the same time, these enormous investments have to be made in renewables. And the IEA in this recent investment report, what I think was released this week or last week, showed that, right? About 580 billion investment in oil and gas, 300 and something billion in renewables. So it is already a significant force and a mature industry, and be there to stay. Right, then just to round off here, so what is required to get this net zero emission world? Because quite often people can easier agree what needs to be done, but it's very difficult how you're going to do it, and especially who is going to do that. So here's a kind of a whole raft of all kind of measures which will be required. And they will be required all at the same time. It's not to say, well, you can do one after the other. We really are quite in an urgency situation to make this happen if you want that NZE, the net zero emission world, by the end of the century. Now, and when you skim these kind of measures, you say, well, actually, a lot of these measures or initiatives are already on their way, and that's true, but probably here, right? And if you could see, I think Paul's presentation, okay, GDP grows still strongest in the OECD, while that energy demand is flat, while then and all the energy demand is non-OECD, and they will still need that energy there, and they will have different focus than we have to actually bring these measures into place. So we have to take a leading role in actually developing the technologies, de-risking it, and actually implementing it, and having kind of regulatory framework for that, so that people who invest in any of these technologies have a secure mechanism to recover their investments eventually. Now there are two actually measures which are lagging, severely lagging. And that is one, the measure is carbon capture and storage. And as I heard Paul saying, well, the industry needs that, to de-risk their legacy products, and that's in a sense true. But it's even in a decarbonized world, and where you push renewables as much as you can, you will still need carbon capture and sequestration. So therefore, it is a solution you will need anyway at some moment in time. But the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes and more expensive it to do. Because it's a stock problem, CO2, everything you don't emit now, you don't have to compensate double for later. So that is one thing. So we are very vocal in that we think that technology should be developed and de-risked. And the other thing is, of course, carbon pricing. That is also, and that will be the most efficient instrument, whatever you choose, if it's with a trading scheme or with taxation, that will be the most efficient policy to actually achieve this decarbonization world. Now, just to round off, what is Shell doing? Three things I'd like to share here in this is that first we actually participate very actively in what we call public collaborative platforms to advocate this net zero emission world and to drive policy towards this world. Because we think that once the policies are in place, companies like us, we can actually start really operating, because then you can start creating scale. At the moment, scale in all these issues are, say, in all this new technology is still an issue in a sense, right? You really have to scale up there. Second thing is, of course, we look at our own operations to decarbonize it, and the low-hanging fruit is, of course, use renewables as energy input for your fossil fuel production. We do that in Oman, for instance, or carbon capture sequestration in our oil sands projects. But we like to go further than that, and that actually is translated in what we call a new strategic theme, new energies, and our focus there is very much on biofuels, which we're already in quite big. Wind, particularly offshore wind at scale, really big scale. Hydrogen as a carrier, as a factor, so you can't transport all these electrons from solar and wind eventually by cables and store it in batteries. For longer distances, hydrogen is a very good medium. Certainly when in the countries who have gas grid, you know, like Denmark offshore, if you have wind and the gas grid, you can use that gas grid also to store hydrogen, and to a certain extent. So it is a kind of, you know, piggyback situation there. And then the last thing of the strategic theme is what we call digitalization. The whole digital revolution and how consumer behaves, how you manage demand, but also actually how you manage your operations, etc., is very much in, well, a big theme, how that can actually help here. And with that, my time is exactly 0. So with that, it's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.